Have you ever stood in a room where the lights went out long ago, but you keep reaching for the switch? You don't heal by holding on, you heal by walking away, even if your heart hasn't caught up yet. There's a cruel irony in this, the very place you turn to for safety. The relationship you poured your soul into, the environment where you first learned to see your shadow. It can become the cage that keeps you from growing beyond what you discovered there. What if the only way forward isn't deeper in, but out? Elena sits in her car after another therapy session journal filled with months of shadow work. She's mapped every wound, traced every pattern back to its source. She knows exactly why she attracts unavailable people, why she sacrifices her needs, why she stays small to make others comfortable. But here's what no one prepared her for: knowing your shadow doesn't automatically set you free. She looks up at her apartment building, the same walls where she's spent 2 years excavating her psyche, the same relationship where she's tried to practice every healing technique she's learned. Everything looks identical to 6 months ago. But something inside her has shifted, and now this familiar space feels like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The most dangerous moment in shadow work isn't when you're blind to your patterns. It's when you see them clearly and realize you're still living inside them. Elena's not broken anymore. She's awake. And that's exactly the problem. Take a breath with me for a moment. If this feels familiar, you're not alone. Here's where Carl Jung's shadow work gets complicated, and where most people get stuck. You've done the inner excavation. You've faced the parts of yourself you'd been denying. You understand your psychological inheritance, the ways your family's unhealed wounds became your coping strategies. You can see your projections, your defense mechanisms, the unconscious contracts you made to survive. But integration doesn't happen in your head. It happens in your life. And sometimes your life is the very thing preventing your integration. Think of it like this. You're tending a garden, watering it faithfully every day, but the soil is dead. No matter how much attention you give, how many seeds you plant, nothing grows. The problem isn't your effort or your intention. The problem is the ground itself. Elena's persona, that carefully constructed self she presents to the world, keeps whispering the familiar mantras. I can handle this. I'm strong. I don't give up on people. Real love means working through problems. These aren't lies. They're truths that became prisons. But her shadow that rejected and denied part of herself is finally speaking up. You're bleeding out trying to keep everyone else comfortable. You've become so good at understanding other people's darkness that you've forgotten your own light. This is the paradox of shadow work. The more conscious you become, the more unbearable unconscious environments feel. Jung called this the transcendent function, the tension between opposing forces in the psyche that ultimately leads to growth. But here's what he also understood sometimes. Transcendence requires letting go of what you're trying to transcend with. Elena realizes she's been trying to practice self-love in a relationship that requires self-abandonment. She's been trying to set boundaries in a space that only functions when boundaries disappear. She's been trying to honor her authentic self while playing a role that demands she stay hidden. The shadow work revealed her patterns, but it also revealed something else. She's outgrown the container of her current life. And this is terrifying because walking away feels like betrayal, not just of others, but of everything you believed healing was supposed to look like. Your nervous system was shaped by the belief that leaving equals abandonment, that choosing yourself equals selfishness, that outgrowing someone equals cruelty. But what if staying when staying requires dimming your light? is the cruelest thing of all. Here's the truth that will save you years of confusion and self-doubt. Healing isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about having the courage to release what's keeping you broken. Carl Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But he also understood something that gets lost in most discussions of shadow work. Once you've gained that understanding, once you've integrated those projections back into yourself and done the inner work of reclaiming your disowned parts, you're no longer the same person who entered that dynamic. You've evolved. Your consciousness has expanded. Your capacity for authenticity has grown. And evolution sometimes means outgrowing your environment like a tree that's gotten too large for its pot. Elena's breakthrough came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the same corner booth at the coffee shop where she'd spent countless hours journaling about her relationships, analyzing patterns, practicing gratitude for the growth her challenges had catalyzed. She was writing about appreciation, trying to maintain perspective on how much her difficulties had taught her, when a question emerged from her pen that stopped her mid-sentence and changed the trajectory of her entire life. Who am I when I'm not carrying someone else's shadow? She stared at those words, feeling something shift in her chest like a key turning in a lock she didn't know was there. For 2 years, she'd been so focused on understanding why she attracted certain people, why she stayed in draining situations that everyone could see were unhealthy except her, why she felt responsible for everyone's emotional state, like some kind of energetic janitor, constantly cleaning up messes she didn't create. She'd traced these patterns back to childhood, with forensic precision, identified the original wounds, practiced self-compassion for the protective mechanisms she'd developed. She'd learned about trauma bonding attachment styles, generational patterns, nervous system responses. But in all that excavation of what was wrong, she'd never asked the most important question: who is she becoming? And does her current life have room for that person? The Carl Jung Shadow Work had shown her the protective mechanisms she'd developed, the hypervigilance that helped her read dangerous situations, the people-pleasing that kept her safe in unpredictable environments, the emotional caretaking that earned her love when being herself wasn't enough. But it had also awakened parts of herself that had been sleeping for so long. She'd forgotten they existed: creativity that wasn't performing for approval, authenticity that didn't need to be translated into palatable language, intuition that trusted her own perceptions, the capacity for joy that wasn't contingent on other people's moods or needs. These weren't new additions to her personality that she'd developed through therapy. They were recoveries, archaeological discoveries. She was remembering who she'd been before she learned to contort herself to fit other people's definitions of acceptable, before she learned that her value was tied to her usefulness, before she absorbed the message that her needs were too much and her authentic self was too intense. But here's where it gets psychologically complex in a way that Jung understood, but that modern relationship advice completely misses. The people in her life had fallen in love with her wound, not her wholeness. They were attracted to her self-sacrifice, her emotional availability, her willingness to absorb their discomfort and reflect back only what they wanted to see. They hadn't signed up for her boundaries, her authentic emotional expression, her refusal to carry what wasn't hers to heal. This is the hidden cost of shadow work that no one warns you about. You don't just heal yourself. You heal yourself out of certain relationships, certain jobs, certain versions of yourself that others have invested in you maintaining. You discover that some people in your life are more comfortable with your dysfunction than your growth, because your dysfunction serves them in ways they're not conscious enough to acknowledge. Elena realized she'd been trying to practice wholeness in spaces designed for her brokenness. She'd been trying to be authentic with people who only felt safe around her masks. She'd been trying to honor her inner wisdom, while living in environments that required her to doubt herself, question her perceptions, and prioritize everyone else's comfort over her own knowing. The revelation wasn't that these people were inherently bad, or that these spaces were fundamentally wrong. The revelation was simpler and more devastating. They were wrong for who she was becoming. They belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed, a version that had served its purpose and was now complete. Jung understood this when he wrote about individuation, the psychological process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind to achieve wholeness. But individuation isn't just an inner process. It's also an outer one. Becoming whole often requires choosing environments that can hold your wholeness, relationships that can appreciate your complexity work, that honors your authentic gifts rather than just your adaptability. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, Jung wrote. But he also knew that becoming requires leaving behind who you used to be, and sometimes leaving behind the people and places that need you to stay that way. This isn't about blame or judgment or creating enemies out of people who simply can't grow at the pace you're growing. It's about recognition. Some people and places are meant to be chapters in your story, not the entire book. Some relationships are meant to crack you open so you can discover what's inside, not to hold what you discover. Some environments are meant to teach you who you're not so you can finally remember who you are. Elena sat in that coffee shop pen trembling as she wrote 5 words that would redirect her entire life. I am not who they need me to be anymore. And for the first time in 2 years of intensive inner work, instead of feeling guilty about that truth, instead of trying to figure out how to make it work anyway, she felt something she'd almost forgotten was possible freedom. If you've ever felt like you're betraying people by becoming yourself, if you've ever felt guilty for outgrowing spaces that once felt like home, pause here and take 3 deep breaths. Your evolution is not a betrayal. It's a birth. And birth always requires leaving the container that once protected you but can no longer hold what you're becoming. The decision to walk away doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages, like watching a sunrise so gradual you don't notice until suddenly the whole world is illuminated. Elena's turning point began with small experiments in absence. Not dramatic exits or confrontational conversations, but gentle withdrawals. She stopped being the first to reach out. She stopped filling uncomfortable silences. She stopped translating her needs into language that made other people comfortable. And something remarkable happened. She didn't disappear. The parts of herself she'd been afraid to lose by setting boundaries, her compassion, her depth, her ability to love, they didn't vanish when she stopped sacrificing them. They became clearer, stronger, more genuine. This is what Jung meant by individuation becoming undivided from yourself. But individuation, Elena was learning, often requires separation, not as punishment or revenge, but as protection of the delicate, vulnerable process of becoming whole. Through her own experience and her study of Jungian psychology, Elena discovered that there are essentially 2 pathways for walking away, each appropriate for different situations and relationships. The slow fade, gradually reducing contact and emotional investment. This works when the relationship or environment isn't actively harmful, just no longer nourishing. You water this garden less and less until you're no longer tending it at all. You redirect your energy towards soil where your seeds can actually grow. The clean break, complete discontinuation, when you recognize that any continued contact requires abandoning parts of yourself you're no longer willing to sacrifice. This isn't about anger or punishment. It's about recognizing that some spaces can't hold your wholeness, and your wholeness is not negotiable. Elena chose the clean break with her romantic relationship, a partnership that had become comfortable but stagnant, where growth was tolerated but not celebrated, where she found herself constantly managing her partner's emotional responses to her evolution. The relationship hadn't become abusive or obviously toxic. It had simply become too small for who she was becoming, like trying to wear clothes from middle school as an adult. She chose the slow fade with certain friendships that had been built around shared dysfunction rather than shared values, relationships where the primary bonding activity was complaining about life rather than actively creating change. These friends weren't bad people, but they were committed to staying stuck in ways that Elena could no longer afford to enable, even passively. Each approach required different kinds of courage, but both required the same fundamental commitment, prioritizing her becoming over their comfort with who she used to be. The hardest part wasn't the practical logistics of creating distance. It wasn't the awkward conversations or the temporary loneliness or even the grief of letting go of relationships that had once meant everything to her. The hardest part was tolerating the stories her conditioned mind created about what these choices meant. You're giving up. You're being selfish. You're weak for not being able to make it work. Real love means staying and working through problems no matter what. But her shadow work had taught her to question whose voice she was hearing when these thoughts arose. These weren't her authentic thoughts. They were the internalized expectations of people who had benefited from her staying small, the inherited beliefs from family systems that confused loyalty with self-abandonment, the cultural programming that taught her to measure love by how much she was willing to sacrifice. The voice of her authentic self was quieter but infinitely clearer. Real love includes loving yourself enough to leave what's diminishing you. Real strength sometimes means walking away. Real growth requires choosing environments that can hold your expansion, not just your contraction. Elena wrote in her journal that night, "I'm not giving up on love. I'm giving up on love that requires me to give up on myself. I'm not abandoning commitment. I'm committing to the person I'm becoming instead of the person I used to be." Walking away became an act of faith that there were people and places in the world who could appreciate her light without needing to dim it first, who could love her wholeness instead of just her brokenness, who could celebrate her growth instead of feeling threatened by it. The void Elena entered after walking away was both emptier and fuller than anything she'd expected. Emptier because she was no longer filling her time managing other people's emotions, analyzing their needs, or trying to fix what wasn't hers to heal. The hours that had been consumed by emotional labor suddenly stretched before her unfamiliar and vast. Fuller because for the first time in years, she was present with herself. Not the self who was reacting to someone else's mood or needs, but the self who existed independent of external demands. She'd forgotten she had preferences that weren't shaped by what others wanted. She'd forgotten she had energy when she wasn't spending it all on translating her needs into requests, her boundaries into apologies, her authentic self into a version others could tolerate. This is the inner return coming home to the parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently for your attention. Elena developed 3 practices that helped her navigate this tender reintegration: weekly values check-ins. Every Sunday evening, she asked herself, what did I do this week that reflected my true values? What did I do that contradicted them? Not as self-criticism, but as calibration. She was learning to use her values as a compass rather than other people's reactions. Shadow dialoguing. When the familiar urge to return to old patterns emerged, and it did emerge regularly, she would write a conversation between the part of her that wanted to go back and the part that knew she needed to stay away. These dialogues revealed that the urge to return wasn't about love or loyalty. It was about fear of the unknown and the comfort of familiar suffering. Anchor rituals. She created small daily practices that reminded her who she was outside of relationship dynamics. 20 minutes of morning writing where she didn't think about anyone but herself. Evening walks where she practiced being alone without feeling lonely. Cooking meals for herself with the same care she'd once reserved for others. The inner return isn't about building walls or becoming selfish. It's about developing such a strong relationship with yourself that you can be generous without being depleted, loving without losing yourself, open without being taken advantage of. Elena realized she'd spent years learning about her shadow, but she'd never actually learned to live from her light. Shadow work had shown her what she wasn't, but integration meant discovering who she was. 6 months after walking away, she looked in the mirror and saw someone she recognized, but had never met herself undisturbed by the need to be anyone else. The loneliness she'd feared never materialized. Instead, she discovered the difference between being alone and being lonely. She'd been profoundly lonely, surrounded by people who needed her to stay unconscious. She felt deeply connected sitting by herself, finally free to be who she actually was. If you're in the void right now, that space between who you used to be and who you're becoming, trust the process. The emptiness isn't permanent. It's compost for whatever wants to grow next. Walking away isn't running from the shadow. It's stepping out of the cage your shadow work revealed was built around you. When you leave what dims your light, you're not abandoning your healing, you're completing it. The Carl Jung shadow integration you've been seeking doesn't happen in the space where your shadow was created. It happens in the space where your wholeness can emerge. Elena's story isn't unique. Every day, people who've done the inner work realize that true integration requires outer transformation. They leave marriages that only function when they stay small. They quit jobs that demand they perform versions of success that feel hollow. They distance themselves from families who only feel safe when everyone maintains the same level of unconsciousness. This isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's honoring what your shadow work revealed. You are not who you used to be, and you don't have to live as if you are. Your healing doesn't require you to stay anywhere that can't hold your growth. Your evolution doesn't require anyone's permission. Your light doesn't need to dim itself to make others comfortable. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But I'd add this: the most liberating thing is to accept that you've outgrown what once fit. If you've ever walked away from something that was killing your spirit, or if you're gathering the courage to do so, now share your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone in choosing themselves, even when it feels like betrayal. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is trust your inner wisdom enough to follow where it leads, even if that's away from everything familiar. Your shadow work brought you this far. Trust it to carry you home to yourself.